some sense, plays a very important role in terms of how we see this. This is beyond engineering or architecture or infrastructure. This is really about the return to more kind of human aspects by treating phenomenon as technology. But since I'm not presenting your project, and the only thing I'm trying to say is that also it was a little bit kind of symptomatic with some of the images and things that you guys have put for Apo's consideration. Those images are much more meaningful when you start to see that the project is not about like a rendering of a spore pod that we have, or it's not just about an image of a cloud. It's about like two things. What's the problem and how it's a very real world problem? How do we conceptualize that problem? And that's like your interpretation of clouds as an infrastructural framework, water as this phase-changing material, which is a kind of magic material in some sense, if you think about it from an architectural perspective. It's also then about how you chose to work on the project, where I think literally having videos and images of some of the physical experiments next to some of the simulations, if you just had to put 10 images together like the mini site is doing, it's that richness of these different kinds of images and experiments and tests that are going to be very exciting, right?
Yeah.
And I see some of these new images and stuff like that, and I want to know a lot more about these physical models and tests. But I'm just saying, like, it's the interesting thing for me about your project is the attempt of doing the kind of science experiment version of things, the attempt of trying to deal with simulation as a real experiment itself, to explore, the conditions of the environment. And then, what we mean by control is not like top-down control. So the machine learning aspect is the learning module of things, how our system can deal with something that's so dynamic. And so I think all of those things are quite important for what you guys are doing. I just mean that because at this stage, I think you guys may be focusing on the final stuff, and that's very important. But to tell the story, I think snapshots along the way in the different ways you worked on the project, I think is important.
So in the beginning, in the introduction video, you think that we should show more about the whole process of the project? Also,
it depends on what we want the introduction to really be, which I think is one of two things. It's either outlining why we're working on this project, or it's really trying to create like a movie trailer that gives, snapshots of basically all of these different things, like jump cuts through different stuff, right? Or I can see a crystal growing, or I can see the scale of a city. I can move into one of your animations, or I can look at the simulation of the cloud, which is more about trying to construct, an overview of what they're going to see, right? Which is meaningly like trying to give a snapshot in a more nonlinear way of what it is that they're going to be looking at. Somehow sets up the expectations of what they're going to see. I don't have a problem the way that you guys have presented the project. I think the project is quite clear. I think the statement of purpose, I think, is a good way to start the project. So I'm not worried about that.
So for now, the introduction has elemental water crisis, climate crisis, arid places, institutional failure, some strategies that have been applied from extreme to primitive,
Yes.
And what if we make infrastructure a phenomenon?
Yeah, I think we can, it's either about infrastructure as phenomenon or looking to phenomenon to operate as infrastructure. Meaning, like in one of the so-called, like where you speak about failure, institutionalized failure, it's more a failure about how we consider infrastructure, which is usually fixed and finite in a sense, right? Usually with very difficult strategies in terms of ecological and environmental forces to control something like water management. So the attempt here is to suggest that, you know, there is a certain radicality of environmental factors that are constantly changing. And to be able to address that, the consideration that we took was more of an augmented strategy. How can we augment nature and think about it as infrastructure? So that the systems of, let's say, water delivery, water management, and water resourcing can be thought about through an introduction of natural systems, of how that is sort of working. And that's where we started to not look at the cloud as a metaphor, but the cloud actually as the infrastructure, you know. So that the cloud is not an image, the cloud is moisture content and wind flow. So a definition about how we interpret the cloud is very important. And then our augmentation of that constructs a system of, you know, agent-based deployment that starts to basically work within that kind of environmental territory, right? Which is ever shaping and shifting, and volumetric pressure systems and these kind of things. So I think from that perspective, the project is quite clear. And I think the presentations have been, up till now, quite good. They've been getting better. I think the issue is about not overly curating certain aspects and trying to find a way to communicate the way that you've been working on these different problems. I think the thing that is important to discuss is how you want to end the project, like the presentation. What is the subject matter that you want to finish on? Like if I asked you what the last 5-10 slides of your presentation are, I think yeah. I think it's good to make it into something that brings back those early questions and showcases how you're responding to them. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Show me what you guys have been working on, and then we take it from
there. Not
there.
overly curate, but communicate more clearly.
I think it's only about communication right now. And I think the only suggestion that I have about that is that it's important to let the work speak for itself. It's important to show, to find a balance between the technical and scientific knowledge that you need to demonstrate to give, people the belief that you've done the work to understand these, climactic strategies. The basic questions that people are going to ask are going to be, unfortunately, in some sense, repetitive, right? I don't think that some of the questions will change that people ask. I think the way is some of those questions may not be asked based on the way that you guys present the work. And, I think it's something that I'm trying to do to kind of diversify the jury so that it's not all architects as well. Because I think that that's also important. So we'll see where I end up with. At the moment, I can say you have a lot of architects, from London that we were hoping to have in the room, but I think the circumstances are a little bit too difficult to meaningfully try to put all of those people in the same space.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think most of the people that will be able to respond to these kind of projects are not really always from that kind of family of design architects. So we'll see how the conversation is. We're trying to be practical on the one hand and also have some people from London practices to kind of help the next stages of your guys' career or jobs and stuff like that. On the other hand, obviously to have a very good discussion about the work. So we'll find the balance of that by Thursday, Friday.
Okay, so this was an attempt. We were trying to think of a way to create a physical model, but the main issue with the cloud is actually that it has no boundary. It's a non-boundary object, so it wouldn't make sense to find a way to print it. So we were trying to find a way to express the gradient density of a cloud. So this would be like either a very expensive gradient materiality printing with hydrogen. We were trying to think that could become stiffer and somehow show an analogy of a cloud. But so we thought that it would be smarter to express that in slices with acrylics and try to give this impression of like an object that is part of an atmosphere and it's not something which has boundaries. And we are printing also, I don't have a good photo, I couldn't find one. Anyway, the model of the forces that created. So we are using the same model to guide the particles and show the forces that are forming the cloud. So we will 3D print that. And we were thinking,
what does that really mean, Daphne? Just so that so that we're very clear about what
the forces.
Well, just as soon as we print something, it has certain connotations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you're telling me you're printing the environment, but the conversation leading up to that was how a cloud doesn't have any boundaries. So when you mean you're printing the environment, what does that mean?
Did I say print the environment? For this one, the forces or
the forces? When you mean like literally, what am I going to be looking at? Because it's very difficult for me to tell what I'm looking at right there.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. I couldn't find the picture because it was very tiny. So the simulation is an advection algorithm. Basically, what fluids are is what the clouds are. It's happening through an advection algorithm that moves the moisture.
Yes.
I would say. So it's a fluid advection. So these forces that create this advection can be depicted in this diagram 3D printing.
Okay. If I can be really honest, I'm not sure what it's trying to communicate. And if it's something that you guys really want to do, I don't have a problem in you guys doing those experiments. But my concern at the moment is like, we don't need to do models to just basically fulfill that as a kind of requirement to have on the table. I think you guys were showing me certain models that you guys were trying to do, which were more like atmospheres and boxes and things like that. The last time we spoke before Christmas.
Yeah, we did that as well.
Yeah. So when I look at these kind of slices and so forth, I see it in the same way that I would look at an MRI brain scan. They are moments in time They do have, an aesthetic and a visual quality to it that tries to index that in some way. And I think, yes, it's an attempt to basically communicate something through laser cutting and etching and so forth. I wouldn't spend too much time talking about it in terms of like literally talking about it. The laser cutting and indexing, like these kind of like almost scientific, like microscopic, what do you call it? Like glass slides, I think speak to the language. The slide 5, though, when you start introducing printing, I think that starts introducing a kind of process, which I think is not really, I mean, I can imagine, people wanting to discuss what you mean by printing and how does that somehow mean, how does that work within the project. So the aspect of you guys printing something and so forth, for me, the process of that is not important in your project.
Okay.
If you wanted to literally 3D print, your vessel to kind of explain how these things are nested within each other, I think that's something different. The most object aspect of what you guys are doing is the two agents and how they nest with each other, right? How you have a certain population of agents that are nested and something else. But outside of that, it doesn't seem to me like you guys have literally design objects, right? You have this kind of notational system, which is really about trying to look at forces and environments. You're working on a kind of global scale with micro kind of particles that are basically shot into the world, right? Seeded into the world. So I think the logic of that stuff, I think, is clear on simulations and is clear on things. I'm not sure that we need too many representational models of that.
So these, you think that they wouldn't help? We were thinking to produce more on Monday.
I don't think it doesn't help. I'm just saying that it's something that I would have on the table with your other things. It's not something that I think is so important to kind of spend a lot of time in your presentation talking about.
No, we shouldn't spend time. I mean,
I think
we can just have it on the table.
Absolutely. And you can show it. You can say, like, here's a model that indexes, moments of time for the critics and stuff like that. You can have a picture of it, photographed nicely in your presentation. So you can see those things. Or an animated, film of the slides kind of going through that as a time lapse.
It's not a time, it's the same cloud. It's just like an MRI scan that you can scan.
I understand. I just mean, like, if I looked at the laser cut file or I looked at the model, the difference is really in the qualities of the model as an object, right? The information is the same. So what I mean is, like, to have a beautiful model that indexes that, I could have a very nice picture of that as a physical object. And the diagrams that you use to laser cut it on the right-hand side of it to basically give that information in one slide. I just mean, like, if you think about all the material that has been generated, I wouldn't spend, if we had a section on models, let's say, which we don't, it would be more important for me that you spend appropriate amount of time of how you were working with atmosphere, right? So those experiments that I saw upstairs on the 3rd floor with the dry ice and all of those things, for me, those were models. They're ephemeral in a sense. They're not representational. And they exhibit those qualities of atmosphere that deny the object. So that's the reason where I'm suggesting that, these physical models may be nice for you and for, maybe they do communicate some qualities in a physical object that are more indexical, like help explain aspects of it. And they become part of the quality of the presentation in terms of what people see and how you guys tried stuff. But at this stage, I don't think we need to generate a lot of this I think you can do that. And if you have somebody helping, they can go and laser cut all of that stuff and set up the model as you like. But that's basically what I'm suggesting. I wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about what this model actually is. It would just be a statement and just a beautiful photograph with maybe some of the some of those drawings indexed out as a diagram next to it. It would be, a couple of beautiful images, and you can expand on that in the book, which I think has to be done as well, obviously. So we need those kind of things together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So long story short about the 3D printing piece, it's not so clear to me what you guys are doing with it. So if it's
3D printing, yeah, we can.
if you want
it was like a blueprint, like showing, because for us, since it's a process, we don't have a blueprint. So maybe diagramming the forces would be a kind of blueprint for us, showing the diagram of the forces.
I understand in some degree. I just feel like from a very basic point of view, and also from a critic's point of view, if I asked you, why it's important to depict that in this way, I think it would be difficult for you to answer. Because you're working so long in simulations and so forth, which are really the models that are not just representation, right? They're demonstratable. Like in many ways, your project and a lot of the projects in my studio kind of deny the physical object because they're dealing with ephemeral conditions, which are very transformative. And so the role of simulation and what it plays in the project is not animation. Simulation here is a demonstration of an environmental model. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Meaning, like, in the past in my studio, simulations obviously were important to showcase time. And they were important to showcase, the rules of organization. And we always tried to do that at a high population. And there were all kinds of challenges, obviously, around that, choreographies and all of this. This is different. We still have high population. We still have choreographies. We still have agent-to-agent interaction. But the most important part is the simulation between the environment, to demonstrate the environment and how our agents participate in that. Because in your case specifically, the environment is the project. You're augmenting the environment. You're creating the conditions for atmosphere and moisture. And so that's why I'm saying, these kind of models for me, experiments, they speak to, really a way of working on this project that is really trying to discover something instead of represent something. Do you guys understand what I mean by that? Discover is really like also testing, the notational and the indexical aspects of your simulations, working with a certain sensitivity with atmosphere to get a closer understanding of the material that you're working with. It's not that different, like if you were someone who did Japanese, wood detailing, you can have all the ideas of things, but you have to work with the material to understand it, to understand what's appropriate ways of working with it, how to work with the material versus working against it. So that's what these examples for me somehow communicate. Now I have to see, when I look at a slide like this, it's okay, but it's difficult for me to understand meaningful difference. So for example, on the left, I see number of atomizers within the same volume. Is there something meaningful in the rate or the speed? Probably more is more in this case in terms of that small boundary.
Yeah, it looks like more is more, and it looks we also increase the fan speed, but it's not really. It shows when there is no fan, but we have no recordings. Like no fan has a clear difference, and I think fan 1 to fan 4 has a difference, but in between we don't really see.
Yeah, so I think the only thing that you guys need to showcase, it's two things. You either slow a slide to communicate that you experimented with, like this, zooming into this kind of detail communicates a lot more to me than seeing those little thumbnail stamps. Because the question that would arise is the question that I would ask. You label very clearly that there's a difference of number of atomizers. The volume hasn't changed. So what was its influence? It was less apparent that there were more fans. I have to say, I read the thing from left to right, focusing more in terms of the number of atomizers and trying to understand if there was a meaningful difference in them. You know, these closer versions seem to me to be more interesting for critics and jurors to try to understand how you set up the variables of that. And I think, you know, I think it's also important to say, you know, that, you know, documenting these kind of experiments is also an art in itself. So some of the things that maybe were more present in the physical experiment are harder to capture. You know, for example, like when we were doing memory cloud and all of these things, very difficult to photograph something like that, you know, because the light changes, because the atmosphere is changing so fast. So there are also issues of documentation which become a challenge. It's not so important to speak to all of that stuff, but I just mean, you know, it is something that maybe not so clear in certain experiments and much clearer in others. Like this slide for me is a better slide than the one that had all of them as a list.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, sure. You want to show the final video, maybe? Yeah. To have a discussion on that. It's important. We will start the final video first of all from the weather system.
Yeah.
Then we will go to the like as if we are from the eyes of the agent, and then we will go to the human scenario.
Yeah, can I just make a quick comment about the image that's in front of us?
Yeah.
Because we haven't talked a lot about the human side of it, but what's important, I think, clearly, is to understand that, you know, in the context of all of the different references that we had in terms of where water played a role civically and socially, you know, one extreme, the step wells. The other one was, you know, the kind of African, you know, rain harvesting device. There was an organization for how human extraction of that resource was done. So when I look at this image, for example, and I see 3 lonely people and a big cloud coming, it communicates something different to me, meaning like, unlike clouds that bring water, it's not really a delivery system in the same way. I think it has to be something more primal. So we should just try to think about what the human and the cloud discussion really is about, which is about water again, right? It's not like humans see the cloud and they run to the cloud. Because this kind of imagery, I think for me, kind of communicates that. I see the cloud coming, which means that the water is coming, and then the people, you know, for example, are in the same image as the cloud. I'm just asking you guys to consider that a little bit. What is it? What is it really about the cloud coming that triggers the human being brought into the scene. I'll play an image out from my head and you guys use it or throw it away as you like. I don't want to overly curate everything at this stage, but if I was living in this kind of arid environment and I saw a cloud coming and I knew that it was going to be raining, what I would do was probably put out the vessels that would capture the water. My human activity would be less about me running to the cloud, but by maybe me putting out the objects that will basically contain the water that will fall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we were thinking more of creating like a rocky surface that somehow hosts, yeah.
I'm only mentioning it because we haven't ever fully discussed this kind of stuff, but we've talked about this at different stages of the project. About, do we design the receptacle? You know, is that really what we are doing? Or are we creating the conditions? You know, I think, like, for example, where I see the vegetation popping up from the ground, this is more like a vision of how the cloud is changing the landscape, right? This is one scenario of a sustained rainfall and cloud experience that would allow this thing to create a kind of urban oasis, you know, a farming oasis within the arid context. So that's one scenario. But for that to be also a scenario, this is more like a collage, right? It's less me visualizing that. It's me more just communicating that with a sustained rainfall, we could consider making like an urban jungle or a certain kind of, you know, climactic oasis within this harsh area by really creating these kind of microclimate environments in a way that keeps the cloud in a particular area. That could be one scenario. The other scenario, which I think is much more, if you ask me, realistic, is that we're creating the capacity of bringing rain in a more deliberate way. So instead of waiting for nature to bring rain, you know, because in some areas, through climate change, but also through just change, because humans are there, you know, we have very different kinds of land, you know, demands on water resources. So this way, you know, if there's more sustained rain, then the same kind of primitive tools that are used to harvest water in any shape or form in these kind of contexts could work, which means that the project is more capable to be thought about in different kinds of environments, right? But the arid environment is the most critical one because that means that there's no moisture there. So for example, when I'm looking at this scene, I would want somehow to demonstrate the activity of what brings people there. It's not a social gathering, but there may be some social aspects to things. You can imagine people bringing, you know, everything from buckets to plates or whatever to capture the water and then transport it back where they do to their homes. But it doesn't demand that you're designing things. This is just an awareness of the kind of water collection aspects that people use, which I think is a more sensitive way to think about this, if you ask me honestly. You know, when Patrick keeps talking about putting crowds and things, I think, you know, realistically, it doesn't really mean anything, you know. You know, seeing people chatting or having lots of people chatting or seeing people sitting, it's a very passive thing. It doesn't say anything about what an event actually is or how the architecture participates. Here, for example, I would say that it would be much, much more about strategies of how people get the water than people just being in the same scene with a cloud.
Yeah, here we were thinking of that as a shade for it.
I don't think these kind of things is really important at all on the project. I know you guys are responding to comments, but I have to be honest. I think my studio always at this stage tries to do more than it's actually trying to do. And that's usually because there's always going to be somebody saying like, well, could it be a shading device, or do we really care about it being a shading device here?
I think it is about like a solar geoengineering project, because
Yes, but the shading project would only be meaningful if that cloud is fixed there, like a fixed canopy. And our project denies that, because the truth of the matter is that that's not actually what we're trying to primarily do. So I'm only stating these things that, yes, potentially it could be something like that in the future. But you guys have a really tough time trying to communicate how to bring water to a place.
Yeah, because we haven't really discussed we haven't solved the part of how you collect water. So how could we show something that?
I think I gave you a very good suggestion. I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but that's actually how it works. Because you guys focusing on trying to make a jungle over here is a kind of sci-fi fantasy. I don't think it's a bad thing to do. I think it is one extreme version of what you do, by basically suggesting that if we can control clouds over time, we can kind of help to augment the landscape. So it's less about bringing water resource to a place, and it's more about geoengineering a more habitable landscape. But the reality is that people live here by sometimes choice, sometimes political, social issues. Regardless, they live there and they've managed to be adaptive to it. What we want to do is to kind of augment the kind of extreme nature of some of these things, to change the quality of life of people, that they can have more sustained, access to water, because there's also a recognition of an intensification of climate change, right? With more extreme weather, with more extreme circumstances, temperatures getting higher, and all of these things, which will make water more scarce. And that's part of, I think, where the project is very important to communicate that aspect. But as images right now, from my perspective, this kind of falls into a much more conservative idea of what this project is, in terms of a more science fiction kind of approach to it. And I don't think that the project is science fiction at all. Like, I don't really think that I need the cloud to give me shade. For the people that are living here, they know the cycles of life. They know when they come out, they know where they stay in. And, the issue is that water is very scarce. And they have practices of collecting water, especially when it comes to rainwater, which is basically what the project is proposing. So I would try to visualize that, which showcases, I think, a way that you can use the local and cultural knowledge that you may have of how those practices are happening, so that you don't need to educate people about how to gain access to your project, but your project is so elemental that it amplifies basically the everyday struggles that communities actually have in these environments.
Yeah.
Does this make sense to you, all of you guys, or is it something that I'm saying that you guys disagree with? I don't, I don't want to take executive decision on these things, but I think that it's very important to understand that one of the reasons why we always had this struggle about designing the ground is that as soon as you do that, it goes back to the idea of fixed infrastructure, or it goes to the problem of having to design products and distribute and deploy these kind of things. And my real feeling, and this is why honestly, like, I don't have any problem of changing my whole agenda in the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years to do a meaningful response to some of these environmental challenges. For example, of course, we could have more automated ways of deploying robotic stuff in this kind of landscapes, but it's a very different thing. And at the heart, makes it so dependent on the things we design. What I like about this project is that design is invisible. Design is really returning to something that is very primal and very human. I think that this is my real, how can I say this? This is my feeling to explain to you guys what it will mean to be an architect today, which is very different than also what our colleagues are also doing in the DRL, or how people are really talking about sustainability and all of these things. I really see things very, very different. I feel that people are just marketing. They don't discuss serious problems of a certain magnitude. And we bring in subjects sometimes like, for example, solar shading, which is just a comment that maybe is actually meaningless to the project, but then somehow needs to be discussed. And I feel like you guys are setting up a very important project by rejecting those kind of simplistic ideas. If I have a team that should be doing that, is my fire team, which, to be honest with you, I think is the only team that really is designing a building system in a traditional way, and yet they're not doing it sometimes. Your project for me is really about ephemeral infrastructure. And that's also why I also have been so close to it, to try to help you understand the reasons of the decision making and the reasons why I'm communicating certain things to you guys, right? So I don't know, you can tell me what your thoughts are to what I've said, but I think these kind of images for me are very dystopian. It is a very kind of lonely future if we need this kind of cybernetic cloud to come and we stand in solitary ways, just waiting for the rain, you know, kind of without any understanding of how we collect the rain. It's just like standing there. And you have to understand the purpose of this animation right now is to really communicate what happens when the cloud and the rain comes. And that's why I'm saying those traditional attributes of water harvesting that people have as limited and as everyday should be represented. And if you can instruct that in a way better, like I see a pattern of bowls and things like that that may be traditional used to harvest water, and you can help guide a more optimized and efficient way to distribute that, better than just people just randomizing, putting stuff. But I think whatever it is, you have to give agency to those people to be able to see their harvesting as something that they can do, because nobody will be able to do it for them, right? We didn't do the Amazon delivery version of water. We decided, and I think rightfully so, to do this kind of project.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do. You have to understand. But you have to understand why I'm saying it, because I look at this and I can imagine the kind of conversation that's going to happen around this, which I would say will remove a conversation that we've been trying to have for a long time, which is the argument for an ephemeral architecture.
We said we tried not to show the whole cloud simulation because it would look like a bit of it always looks like a bomb because it's much faster than it really is. I totally understand the point about that it looks a bit dystopian, and
it doesn't have to be. I'm just stating that the people right now seem to be randomly placed, being attracted to the cloud. But it doesn't give me any meaningful information about why they're going to the cloud. To go to the cloud means that they're going to the water resource without any kind of visual representation. But to do that means that they're going there with a purpose. It's not entertainment. They're going there with a purpose in an almost survivalist approach to collect the water, which is a very, very scarce resource. And that's why I'm saying that I think it's very important to end the presentation in a meaningful way. One scenario is the extreme scenario, that you can build a jungle like a rainforest in the desert. And you can say to me, that's the final version. What happens if we play this scenario to an extreme? Means that we can sustain vegetation and moisture in an area and try to impact it in a more permanent way. But the real purpose of that, I think, would be about allowing people to collect the water with the tools that they have and to bring it back to their villages or to their cities in a way that's meaningful to them. And the strategies for that could be using existing irrigation networks, using landscape. But if I'm visualizing it at the scale of the human, I'm visualizing it with the receptacles that they can have to gain the water that they need. That's where I don't see it different than the step well. The step well, you brought your vessels there to collect the water and to bring it back. The water harvesting tower in Africa, you bring your vessels to fill up with water. I see it in that sense much more evolving that situation. I leave it to you to think about. I'm not going to say much more than that, but I'm just talking about what I see.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that I just do this. In my mind, the aspect of the solar geoengineering of the project is very important, because the fact that we know that there are already studies happening that prove that clouds lower down the temperature.
Yeah.
And it could be also a way to solve through the albedo and their reflectivity. And it could be also a way to solve or address the issue of climate change and the issue of extreme drought in places like Africa, in developing countries. This aspect is very important, and I think it's also like it's happening now. It's a part of research that's happening now.
I'm not going to let's say challenge that. I'm just going to say that that's a different project. I don't
is
think that that's the
explicitly
project.
talking about.
I don't think that that's what you guys have been working on. I think it's a way of interpreting cloud coverage and a way of thinking about how a cloud could potentially perform in a different way. If you ask me honestly, that's not what you've been working on. So if you ask me if I think it's important, it could be. Do I think it's important in your project? No. The reason that I say that is that you've been looking at cloud behavior with a certain lens, which has to deal with moisture and the releasing of that moisture. The premise of the project was always that air moisture and air particles is everywhere, but our access to it is not. So our project in some ways is to trigger that, to make that accessible for people. And I'm speaking about it at the heart of what the project is, in my interpretation, obviously. But I think it's an interpretation that I don't put forward as an opinion. It's really in terms of how we worked on the project. That's why I have, when I listen to your discussion about cloud coverage and almost like a canopy-like image, you know, some stuff like Patrick was saying and things like that. I don't have any sensitivity to anything that anybody wants to do, but it's just not what we're doing right now. So when I'm looking at these images and we're looking for a finality, it's not a finality. It's to basically say, like, we worked to demonstrate that it can be taken seriously, that we can control clouds to release water within this kind of system. To communicate a closure to this thesis for this presentation, I would say, show that. But to show that means that the people that we want to give access to that water have access to that water. And without trying to design how they retrieve that water, you're just demonstrating that all of the local and traditional ways of collecting and harvesting water are still at play. We don't need to design those things. The people there deal with those realities on every day. They will use the tools that they have with them because they live in an area of extreme resourcefulness. And they will gain access to it by us triggering that event that they collect water from more often and in a maybe more sustained way to support the life that's living there without the extreme nature of the condition that they have. This is basically why I think this project is important. There may be a lot of people that don't know why we would do something like this. Or maybe people have an idea that we could change the weather. Yes, of course, we're changing the weather. Of course, we're changing the weather. The weather is not inhabitable for people in this area, but we don't have so much control that we're changing all weather everywhere. We're not trying to make, the Sahara Desert into London, right? We're not trying to bring the London fog into, Ethiopia. That is geoengineering at the scale that would be a very, very different project. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure I would support that project, if you ask me honestly, in terms of its premise. Because working with nature is different than working against nature. And that's why I find this sensitivity in terms of how we speak about augmentation and symbiosis and all of these things to try to address in the most sensitive way. And that's why I also say that the project's not about representations. The project is about demonstration of knowledge. That's why the models that you do that are experiments, you try to discover how things work. You try to see the sensitivity of how temperature actually really affects these systems, I think is very, very meaningful. And that's why I also respect the project in the way that I do. But I also think it's very easy to miscommunicate a project like this. I think I've been always understanding of the different tangents you guys have jumped to, but I think at this stage, once again, I'm not going to curate the final aspect of it. You guys do it the way you think is best, but this is my suggestion, honestly. I think it speaks with a sensitivity that this kind of project demands. So this is my Christmas gift in terms of giving you an ending to the story if you want it. And once again, I would not be in any way, shape, or form disappointed if you want to have a different narrative for the ending. But my recommendation would be is not to introduce other variables because we haven't addressed this one. I think this one has been left with an understanding that each of the local communities may address that in a different way. You've chosen one, and I would say what local and traditional kind of means to collect water would be able to be represented in your final scenario. That would be a meaningful way to communicate that.
Yeah.
So I don't disagree with you, Daphne. I just don't think that complexifying the situation is meaningful. And I don't want to reject comments that you have gotten from other tutors. But to be honest with you, I don't feel that they really speak to the importance of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Is there something else you guys want to ask about this situation with these images?
It's just the intention. The intention of this is to show what is the environment initially and how it eventually gives them, the environment that it's like. I understand about the collecting, and like we were thinking about like putting like a stream of rocks where it's naturally collected, because this is where the rain, like the cloud will be and the rain will come down.
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation of what you guys are saying here is that kind of more extreme scenario where you can say a cloud can sit here trapped between this and generate a maybe more sustained environment, so that I see this more like a biodome. But this to me is not really the everyday scenario of your system. It seems to me like maybe a suggestion that if we can demonstrate an active release through this kind of dynamic environment for water, what if we can sustain clouds by utilizing, let's say, terrain like this to create these kind of, microclimates, very local, to generate these kind of, oases within the desert, right? It's like the concept of the mirage in some sense, but, using the landscape to say that this would grow. But if that's the case, I wouldn't want to see it just like a patch of, green moss on the ground. I would want to see it as an urban jungle that is harvested with the things that could grow there that is obviously not shown in this kind of animation right now. That would be an extreme scenario of what it would mean to keep the same system localized in a way. And the way that potentially that could happen is by thinking about the cloud nested within the existing environment to allow that to happen. But that's extreme scenario, and that would be scenario 2. And I wouldn't mind that to be there, but I would say that that's not the first scenario.
Yeah, so we can keep this for example, it's a future vision of like what can develop into more than just giving water and the people that, no, it's more about also we can control the cloud in terms of
Yeah, I think I was
being released as a fog, and then there is vegetation, like what you said. Like
my point is taking, if you can do the first one,
yeah,
which is what I think the project is,
mm.
then thinking about a scenario of extending that durationally. And in this case, it's by utilizing the landscape to keep the cloud in an area in a much more sustained and controlled way, would afford the possibilities to think about how we could cultivate more of a sustained presence that would allow for a different kind of growth that's not natural to the existing terrain.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a what if. That's like, the first part is not what if. The first part is what we say. We're bringing the rain. People collect it with their stuff. And I don't think that that's a minor point. I think if we could achieve that, that's revolutionary. I think this other part's about literally geoforming the whole world. This is where I think we have to be a little bit more careful. So the intuition of using the existing landscape that has a natural kind of valley where the clouds can help control the variability of the environment that would force the cloud to dissipate and change makes sense. And if I can do that, then over time I change the immediacy of that landscape. But that to me is a second order or third order of the project. It's not the primary thing. And once again, if I do that, I would visualize it differently. Like I'm visualizing the inside of an Eden project or something like that, where I have different kinds of growths that people can use. And it's not something that I would speak to too much either. It's just to construct the image of what that scenario would be, which would be much more about food production, right? And farming, than it would be about leisure and just kind of having a couple of people walking there. It would show a different concept of the rural, like the Earth team is speaking about. And that's where I think these projects are inextricably linked in the concept of the elemental. And that's by design. That's not by chance from my side. So I think I'm quite clear about what I'm suggesting. But I also think I'm quite clear about the nature of what an image actually says. Like visualizing some fog doesn't mean that I have sustained growth here. And the problem of actually visualizing the cloud right on top of a human is that you're trying to communicate the relationship with the human as a piece of cover, like the sun shading conversation, not as a piece of bioclimatic difference, right? The cloud doesn't necessarily have to like fit as a roof, like in this image. So like this could be a sketch of Group Himmelblau, if I have to be honest, which of course I would like, but it's a different generation. It's a different problem. It's a metaphor of a cloud. It's not a cloud. This is a kind of image that also Patrick somehow would like, because Patrick sees this stuff as kind of like Burning Man festival things and stuff like that, which, to be honest with you, I'll speak very honestly, I actually don't like at all. I mean, they seem to just kind of treat things like in a much more marketing kind of approach of what an entertaining experience of being in a landscape. It speaks to nothing about all the so-called environmental aspects and all of these other things, you know, Google's participation in these events and all of that stuff. It's just garbage. It's just marketing. big makes a big solar ball, but it's not about trying to create heat or water or any of these things. It's just to make a big mirrored sphere. All of that kind of stuff for me is really pointless, because in some sense it would be much more honest to just say that we're trying to create an experience for people to have. You know, I don't have a problem with that at all. I have a problem when people are not honest about the motivation about what it is that they do.
Yeah, the only thing is that we try to be abstract, because it's not, whenever you start putting objects, it starts having a cultural identity, and this is becoming really.
Yeah, but can I ask you honestly, Daphne, what's wrong with having a cultural identity? Isn't that something that everybody aspires to develop an architecture that is sensitive to the place that the architecture is deployed?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in this case, why would it be different? I just mentioning that you have the opportunity to do that, which most projects don't. Like, if I have to be really honest with you, like just looking at some quasi, Zaha projects that have landed in New York, a place that I know very well, do I think that those things are going to be successful? Successful to the degree that an interesting architecture could be successful. Is that anything to do with New York? No. And we're talking about New York. We're not talking about a place that doesn't have identity or a generic city. I mean, I don't really think that this is what architects should really aspire to. I don't think it speaks to environment. I don't think it speaks to recognizing meaningful differences in people. It's kind of the generic attributes of things that I hate in bad architecture, but I hate it in also architects who basically don't really believe that any of that stuff is important enough to influence the way that they approach a problem.
So can I ask a question? Is this also this way of visualizing, which is more abstract, let's say, does it look also generic?
I mean, you have to tell me, because I think I'm being quite clear that you have an opportunity to demonstrate that you can incorporate more local and traditional ways of dealing with things, regardless of if you think it's good or bad. By necessity, you haven't designed an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's much more than just if you designed it or if you didn't. It's an acknowledgement that these things are important because people understand how to do this. People will be able to collect their own water. They're not going to be dependent on you. And I think that that's very, very important. I think people don't really understand what it means to make more participatory things. Like the languages that I hear today really don't speak to human problems, because they're not really taking into consideration that there are existing technologies that people have used traditionally to respond to those conditions. And it's not about being traditional for the sake of representation. It's being traditional because that is technologies that have evolved over time that people have implemented to be able to sustain themselves in these environments. That's why I think it's very different, this kind of stupid discussion that sometimes people have in juries with me about us trying to save the world. It's not about trying to save the world. It's trying to understand and meaningfully contribute into systems, which I think is very different. And the reason why architects are quite generally stupid about this is because they assume that they understand things. They assume that the location that they're dealing with, a site, is meaningful. For them, meaning is a territory. It's not about the cultural aspect. It's not about how people will understand and utilize something. And this is very problematic for me. So I'm not making this about me. That's why I'm saying you guys can end the presentation the way that you feel best. This is like my last conversation with you guys in terms of giving you a suggestion to this particular imagery and to this particular conclusion, because this is your ending. And what are the things that are important? I don't think being vague about it is what I ever suggest. And I'm not saying that you should render kind of traditional engravings on the plates and things like that that people use and the bowls. I'm saying demonstrate how people actually would collect the water using the knowledge that they have, instead of trying to create an alternative scenario that has nothing to do with that problem and shying away from it. So I would say have confidence in your project. By bringing the rain, that collection of water would happen more frequently, but with the tools and the limits of this scenario. I think that that would demonstrate confidence. If some architects may not like that or this, in my estimation, doesn't really matter at all. But if I had to communicate this to the UN or to UNESCO or to anybody else, I promise you that they would understand why we're doing this, because it's unlike what people do. They try to sell people on an idea of a complete system without understanding the dynamics that any of those forces actually are in implementation. So I'm having, let's say, the high-level end conversation right now by also putting a critique on the table of our own work. So you can choose the ending as you feel comfortable with it. You can make it as abstract or as real. I'm not talking about quasi-real renderings of everything. I'm just talking about whatever the scenario is that you're doing. Try to speak to the fact of now how people who have access to this water implement strategies to collect it. Okay. Okay. Is there anything else that you guys would like to talk about? Otherwise, probably we'll bring it to a conclusion.
Diagrammatic. This is the machine learning system.
Yes.
This is the cybernetic, because we were discussing about showing the cybernetic diagram, showing this, the loop. Is this? I think the only thing that I would say about these kind of drawings and diagrams, because cybernetic is a word that is loaded, but I wouldn't shy away from it, is to understand why learning, a model of learning, is important for your system. Yeah, it's important because it's actually, it doesn't need, human is out of the loop. So it is kind of, the software itself is closing the loop. So it becomes part of the weather system. It becomes part of the weather itself.
It's a way of taking decisions, right? It's also a way of creating a strategy of communication that's based on data. The data is constantly evolving and changing. It's a probabilistic, measuring and adapting and changing kind of scientific way of mapping something that's in flux, right? Like weather systems and things like that. So in a way, this machine learning strategy is a strategy of making that information meaningful. It's the difference between monitoring the weather and instrumentalizing the weather. We're trying to instrumentalize the weather by creating an awareness of the conditions that could change and allow our system to harness the water. We need that information. And that information is real time and always changing. And the only way to make that information meaningful is to have a system that is continuously trying to understand. If we have an understanding of it, then we can act in the world. If we don't, then our actions are random. And those randomness could sometimes work, but they would have a very high degree of failure.
We're showing the 4 layers. So mapping places of need, humidity data, wind data, and landscape conditions. We're showing how we overlay, how mapping places of need are
Yes.
happens.
Yes.
Through overlaying different data, and from these we define the goal. These will be animated so that we don't show slides. So we create the goal, which is a location and the amount of water that is needed.
Yes.
And then we can say that we evaluate the reward according to the evaluating the environmental conditions and how helpful or not helpful are.
Yes.
Then humidity, then the wind, then topography, and hydrology and topography. These are the layers, the data that are overlaid. And then we're showing the training process. Is this the right video?
So for example, like this video wasn't uploaded. Why is it not uploaded?
Uploaded?
To the...
We're gonna upload them.
Because the one that you guys have uploaded is a high, it's an accelerated speed version of just like moving and stuff like that. But this video is much clearer. This one is much nicer than the one that you guys just put up today or yesterday. And it's not to shy away from things like this either, right? It's not that everything, these accelerated so-called explosions are part of your world. The part of the problem is that that doesn't really mean something on the human scale. At the global scale, of course, it makes a lot of sense.
Since we are showing the weather system in the beginning of the presentation, it's first part we show after the introduction.
Yeah.
Is it correct to show the wind for the cloud formation here, or should we keep it for the final video?
I think you can. It's up to you. See how the flow of the overall presentation is. It's okay to create snapshots that bring back certain information in different parts of the thing. It doesn't have to be so linear. And it's important, I think, also to show how you're applying some of that information in different forms of representation. But this video is very nice. Like, I think in some ways this communicates a lot of the things that we're doing. And Yuji did a really good job with also introducing the voxelization aspect of those cloud mappings and things like that. Because I think that abstraction is meaningful in terms of looking at those volumetrics. These animated diagrams, I think, are quite beautiful, but this kind of like video game aesthetic of landscape and clouds and all of this kind of stuff is important. Because we don't care about having a one-to-one mapping, and that's why abstraction is not what we're doing. It's about really trying to create a meaningful data set. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know it's a difficult thing to do, but these kind of things, even if it's still a bit primitive, already is showing that, right?
And we also wanted to diagram the
last part is also quite nice too. When you show the top view of those agents, like this kind of thing, it's quite beautiful because it's more like a nature show, right?
Mm. And this.
Yeah, and this is also quite nice because actually it's at the cloud and landscape form. But as soon as you introduce little people, and I get a sense of how big the scale is, and having like this little Charlie Brown cloud on top of my head, that's something different.
This we won't include it at all. The last
I just think, like, you know, this one, I mean, it's not bad to have this kind of narrative of a human seeing the cloud, but I would, you know, bring in the conversation really of basically water collection.
Okay. Okay.
And can I ask you that you guys put up all your videos in this folders?
Yeah.
And that you do that now, because I think like some of these animations and some of these diagrams and stuff like that make much better images for your project than one still of a sphere of the water collection or any of that stuff.
Okay.
Because I mean, in terms of communication, you've worked hard to communicate these things in different ways.
Yeah.
So I can help curate those things on the page, on the mini site with Apple when I see all of the team stuff up there. But I want to see all the videos, and I want a collection of a lot of these slides, even if you're just taking screenshots of some of these pages.
Where's the whole video of this? And for the final video, we were thinking of starting like that. Tyler, you want to show the painting part?
Yeah, but
because I see all of them.
This is just a screenshot.
Yes.
Yeah, but the videos actually is in. I can share a bit, but still, I'm still working on it. So.
No, keep working on them. I think just, you know.
Yeah, it was the intention is to show the different stages and different scales.
Yes, I think that that's important. And I think even these smaller scale moments versus some of the larger scale landscapes, I think all of this starts to construct a language, right?
Yeah, this is just the first thing to show the agent how to fly over like the top view to selecting the destination they will reach, and then the second thing will start to zoom in into particular location.
Yes.
And the third thing will like showing the releasing and the cloud actually forming at that point. Yeah, but it's still working on that. So it's it's 3 steps.
Yes, I understand. I mean, the quality of it, I think, is looking good. So I think it's, you know, I think it's good to be able to zoom in and out of these different scales. Like the moment that it goes from the little detail of a particle to the detail of seeing it over a terrain, I think is good. These are kind of like moments that you start to shift in the same video, these different kinds of scales of representation. So I think it's quite good.
And about the cataloging of the clouds, we are trying to find a way. This is like a part about the albedo, which I was wondering whether we should explain that further, like what's but actually we have two kind of outputs: the albedo, coverage, and water content. 3 types of outputs. And maybe we should explain further, like which is the input in only one slide, which are the environmental conditions, and which are the 3 outputs of that. And maybe we should analyze a bit further what is the albedo thing and how it affects the climate. And then
I would try to keep these aspects, quite tight in terms of like clear couple of slides that kind of explain the basic reasons why you're presenting this, why it's important.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't get overly extensive in all of the technicalities. I would try to synthesize it in a way that people understand why it's important and how that influences the way that you guys are working on understanding and developing your system. So there were a lot of these kind of images uploaded and so forth. So that kind of science should be a window into the way that you're working on your simulation, and why the simulation is actually being driven, not necessarily through aesthetic representations, but through informational data sets.
Yeah. So we should emphasize this part of what is driving.
I think that part is much more important than the visualization of the cloud, because that part gives me the information to understand what that cloud is in a way that's different. Right. So in that slide, I wouldn't have 5 depictions of the cloud that's rendered that looks like a cloud. I would have a big part of this slide has a much better layout and proportion to explain, what we were just looking at that moment.
Yeah.
You have the 2 images of the cloud on the left and all of the information infographics. Yeah, like this. This is nice.
Yeah, is that clear?
Yes, it's clear, because
so this is about the input, and this would be about the outlet. This is the output, how we may evaluate the output.
That's fine. So then you have one slide follow the other, right? Where you have that, continuation into the next step. But this slide is quite clear. And, of course, I can spend a lot of time looking at how you are representing each element, but as an overview, quickly seeing something, it makes sense. I have the visual representation, I have the agent representation, I have the environmental conditions, and I have the analysis of the data steps of how I am responding to that information.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, so we will focus we will add the 2 slides for each category, and one is the simulation with the parameters, and then another which could be the still images and the output.
Sure.
How we evaluate the output. Okay. And these are more like I wanted to put the values here, but it's cataloging on when we have the same input and different environmental conditions.
I think that's fine. But just
it's overwhelming if it's not.
I'm not sure it's overwhelming, but just make sure that your presentation is going to be very, very video heavy, right? And for example, some of these things, for example, in PowerPoint, put 9 discrete videos together, compile them and make them into one video to somehow try to optimize the file a bit, but also to optimize any problems that we may have with presentation as you guys continuously build it out. So I think do the things that you think are important. I think, for example, here, the 3 images to the left somehow dominate this. I would make, like we said before, the proportion seemed better with 2 images of the cloud generation and then diagram data. These are going to be all videos, however you guys want to do it. You have a good, clear aesthetic and communication for all of this. So just try to keep it not as a template, but just try to think like, okay, are 3 of these images useful to show time? If so, keep them. Or is it one video that basically showing time? And is that an animated GIF or is that the full video? Whatever it actually is. I don't really care for these animated GIF things. I prefer videos that have a certain quality to them. But, you take the decisions with the time that you guys actually have. I think you have to be very strategic with that and work on the things that you really need to work on.
Yeah. The issue with the video is that it looks very fast when you make it fast in order to play in a time that makes sense. It's very fast and it looks a bit like an explosion.
So, I mean, if that's the case, then just take out 3 time frames that you can have and treat it as an image, or if you prefer to animate them as a GIF, do that in terms of the presentation. Whatever is the clearest to communicate what's necessary. But, I mean, in some sense, you're going to have to find versions of that to be extracted and to placed in your book. And I also think that these are things like phase 1 can actually help do, which is kind of tedious and, at some point, honestly, doesn't need much. It's quite straightforward and explicit for you guys to just have people do those things for you. Yeah. All right, guys. Anything else?
Okay, yes.
I think you're better than okay. I think you have to take the ending in a much more serious way, not shying away from the project, but actually demonstrating an understanding about why we're really doing this. And I understand it's not easy to do. And I understand that it's also difficult to demonstrate some of that stuff. But like I said, if you wanted to do an easy project, you chose the wrong studio. So the point is different. I think you guys have come a long way. I mean, I remember presentations about doing towers and objects, and I remember all kinds of conversations with you guys, and I think all of it has been very meaningful because I've seen you guys all grow and understand in a much, much more expressive and sensitive way. And I think you guys are benefiting from that in each of the presentations. But, and I say this, but there is always a danger of trying to revert to something that somehow makes things like very easy for somebody else to understand. You're not trying to make complex problems easy. You're trying to make them clear. So I don't really care if an architect thinks that we should be making a roof canopy or a piece of entertainment, like me personally. For you guys as a studio, I think that this is a lot of design. And this is also an argument for how simulation is very important because it introduces time and duration. The machine learning work, I think, is super critical because if architecture is going to be intelligent, its only ability is to actually focus on aspects that make it intelligent. All of this AI bullshit stuff that people are doing, just kind of looking at images and shape tweening two different things, is just stupid. It's much more difficult to try to make sense of data and try to see how simulations would really allow you to use that information meaningfully. So it's less about artificial, it's much more about intelligence and demonstrating that in a systemic way. And that's why I also think like we're presenting the project, as an augmentation of nature, honestly, because that's what the elemental is. You know, people talk about this stuff all kinds of ways, but none of it is meaningful because they're not really trying to scratch below the surface of language. And I think over the last year, you guys have done that in a meaningful way. So I would be very excited if I was you to kind of try to push this in a place where all of this stuff comes together. I would, if you ask me honestly, not worry too much about the models you guys presented to me and focus a lot more on the book and focus on the digital presentation and the simulations and the videos. But that's just my opinion. And use the last, 3 to 4 days that you guys have to make sure that you guys talk through all of this stuff and render out the animations that you need to complement this and enjoy it. And then you're going to get some rest, and then you're going to help your tutor finish his exhibition too. So
amazing.
don't think that
We can do that.
Yeah. You guys have some work to do on this as well. Okay. Anyway, listen, I think that the presentation is it's in a good place, but I would say that one of you actually literally focuses on trying to put that work and material together a little bit. Obviously always in conversation with everyone else, but I think it's an important part of your project because you have a lot of material to go through. And there may be moments that need to be edited to basically be a little bit updated or change some of the language that we've talked about. And so I would say that's important. And just kind of push forward. My time, if I have, and there's something critical that you want to discuss, I'll try to make myself available. But to be able to get your presentation, your jury and everything up and running, I'm pretty stretched out, to be honest with you, at the moment. So put the things together. If you have quick questions, we can have a very quick conversation. It won't be 2 hours of talking about your project.
Yeah.
So be very clear about what you guys want to talk about, and I'm happy to give very targeted feedback on it. But like I said, I think the project and the material is clear. I would ask you immediately to kind of upload the things and don't curate anything. Just put up the video content, put up the images that you have in that folder that Alex and Apo are looking at, so that, Apo has generally a good sensitivity to the things that communicate the work visually and through animations. And I can basically review that stuff so that it makes sense. Did you guys update your text?
Not all of it yet, but the introduction.
Yeah, we just need a small text for the piece,
The piece. Yeah.
for the website. So
Yeah.
I think the project has evolved from the previous text a bit, so I think we can be more specific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right.
Thanks a lot.
Can I ask a quick question? Because Gauja emailed me and was telling me that a lot of people have COVID. Do we have a lot of people in the DRL that are not well right now?
Right now, I'm not sure.
I know in the last couple of weeks we've had people, because people have emailed me.
Many people were not good last week. Yes, many people.
Okay.
No, I don't know.
He's
on this line. Okay.
I received from Stefan and Gizem, and there were a lot of people from Patrick's studio that I know of, but just generally speaking, I haven't really asked for a survey of how many people are well or unwell.
Some people don't say also.
Yeah. I think the issue with the presentations is like this. I mean, people obviously need to get tested at the AA. And I think that's the only real way that people will be more honest about this. And I think the issue is kind of like this. Like, of course, I want everybody to be able to present in the space, but that's only if it's done in a safe way. There are a lot of concerns from a lot of different people about this. So I just need to basically have a more honest assessment of where we are with those things. So I think people should be tested on the day as well as the day before, just to be very clear that everybody is on the same page. So I'm going to email everyone about that. Outside of this, yeah, I think, you know, if my email was pretty clear and there's not so much confusion, I'm not sure why there would be confusion. And I've basically said you don't need to print your panels, and we're going to put it on Miro board, and everything else is what you guys know. So physical models and things like that will be addressed by sessions. So if you're presenting in the morning session, for example, you have to be in the lecture hall, having your material there before the session set up. We have 3 rooms: front jury room, south jury room, and the lecture hall. So we'll have the material in each of the spaces, and then that team can swap in whenever they do. So we'll leave about 10 minutes for changing over. I think that should be more than enough time. And yeah, you can communicate the jury and all of that to your friends and loved ones and anybody you want to share that stuff with. I think that we should use the AA Instagram and all of that stuff to communicate the work leading up to the presentations, because so I think like we should just grab like 3 or 4 images or 2 or 3 videos and send it to that guy to basically make a post with a small text of your work. I think it'll be helpful. Just add your Instagram, whatever that you want to add, and yeah, we'll send that across. Okay. Do you guys have phase 1s helping?
Yeah, we do have.
Working with you?
It is a bit difficult because they came very late. So it was for them, it took them time. I mean, they're all lovely people. We have Luisa, Ilya. Luisa also started helping us before before you sent the email, so she was able to help with the model. Yes. And she understands better also the project now. And we have Stephanie, Mona, and Tai. And they are all, I think that it took them time. Also, some of them were traveling from different places of the earth. So we had a bit of a delay. I think yesterday they started pushing. With Luisa, we started even before.
I think with them, honestly, you know, for a project like this, it's not very easy for them to just kind of jump into it, because usually they do dumb things like making model bases and repetitive work usually. But I think like with taking the materials and updating, you know, doing a rough draft of putting the stuff into book format and extracting videos and panels and stuff like that, I think it's helpful for the model that you're asking. I mean, you guys shouldn't spend any time on that, even in terms of the things that you guys actually have to make it more presentable in the space. You know, they can be doing those things. So just go ahead.
We don't have anything for the space, right, except the model.
If you don't have anything for the space, you don't have anything for the space. It's not a problem. My point is, like, making one model to put on a table is not going to be that helpful. For a team like the air team that has made a lot of models and things like that, it's a big part of their presentation. Like I said, your project is different. For the Earth team, the 3D printing of, some of those models and stuff like that's very important for their work. So I need to know what we actually have so that I can be better placed to be able to, communicate how we're going to communicate that in the broadcast.
Yeah. We actually were thinking to make, because now we found a method to do it, which was what took more time. So just creating more of these, it would be, I guess, easy. And Lisa could take care of that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You guys aren't, the things that trouble me in terms of the making part. I'm going to get a better sense from the Earth team about that stuff. And from Patrick's studio, I haven't really seen much making. I haven't seen any making. And from Sajay's studio, that usually should be producing a lot of models and prototypes, I don't see much of that either. So I'll get a sense by speaking to the other tutors where their teams are at with that.
Yeah, DPL was empty. Actually, it was only us. It was weird.
Yeah, you see, this is the part which I find difficult at this stage, because Sajay is making a building and so is Patrick. And there's been very little attempt to actually understand how to materialize those things. And this is an issue. So for whatever the comments that you guys get that force you into conversations about shading and canopy and all that stuff, I also have conversations about, you want to design a building, you should understand what structure and materials are. And if you want to talk about technologies and projections and all of that stuff, it wouldn't hurt you to try to do those experiments. I'm only stating that not as a critique of other people, but more for you to understand with some clarity about why we work the way we work.
Yeah.
Okay, so it'll be an interesting discussion, I'm sure. But whatever the discussion is, it should be somehow organized by the work that you guys do. So I think it's going to be a good presentation for you guys. I think you've worked hard, so you deserve a good jury. But I also think, regardless of whatever the conversation is, you should control it. If a question is off topic, you should explain why that question, in a nice way, was thought about, but actually for this and this reason was addressed in this way. So whatever is being discussed, I think always bring it back to your work and do it in a very professional and an educated way, so that people understand why you're thinking the way that you're doing it, instead of in a defensive way. Okay. All right, guys. Good luck. Stay well. And